All right, guys, welcome back. Today we begin a new study in the book of Daniel. And now, before we actually get into the text of the scriptures, you know we always like to do an introduction of the book to give us an overall understanding of the book so that it can help us better understand the text as we dive deeper into the text. All right, so let's begin. We always begin by noting the author of the book. And the author of the book is its namesake, Daniel. Now, who was this Daniel? Daniel was an exile to Babylon, roughly 605 BC, in Nebuchadnezzar's first incursion into Judah. That is, you have to understand the history of that time. And now, we don't have time to give a history lesson for those particular times, but let's just try to give a little overview. What we have is the decline of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. And it was through Nabopolassar, who was the father of Nebuchadnezzar, who brought about the demise of the Assyrian Empire, along with, for the most part, crushing Egypt at that time, which brought about the golden age and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. Okay, and so after his death, his son Nebuchadnezzar came to power. It was during this time, Nebuchadnezzar's coming to power, that Jehoiakim, who was king of Judah around 605 BC, as we stated earlier, he was basically a vassal to Babylon, but always there would be rebellion. You see that with Jehoiakim, and then even later on in Zedekiah. But we don't have time to do all of that. And so Nebuchadnezzar made a slight incursion into Judah at that time and removed a number of people of the royal families. And one of those persons from the royal family was Daniel. So he was one of the first to be removed. And remember, we'll just say this and we'll move on. There would be three incursions into Judah: 605 BC, 597 BC, and then finally 588/86 BC, where there would be the destruction of the temple. And so Daniel was one of these first of the exiles. He was a very beautiful and very intelligent young man. And also, too, we'll see that Daniel was a very godly young man. All right. So written by Daniel, the author, the date, as we've already said, the incursion 605 BC. So we give the writing of this particular book somewhere around the 6th century BC. So the dating of the book of Daniel around 6th century BC. Some want to give the book of Daniel a much later writing, somewhere around 165 BC or sometime like that. And one of the reasons why they want to give it a much later writing, they want to give it a date that follows after the writings of the book of Daniel. So in other words, they'll make Daniel more like history instead of prophecy. Okay, make sure you guys understand what I'm saying. If Daniel has the earlier writings, which it does, and I agree, I concur wholeheartedly, roughly in the 6th century BC, the book of Daniel, as we look into certain texts of the book of Daniel, is very prophetic. And that's one of the reasons why Jesus called Daniel a prophet. However, if Daniel is given a much later writing, like 165 BC around that time, then Daniel is writing from a historical point of view. That is, a lot of the events have already taken place. But without confusing you again, I hope you understood that, guys. Daniel, roughly 6th century BC. Therefore, much of the text, that is the writing of Daniel, the things that he speaks that will happen, is prophetic. All right. Now let's deal with the purpose, and we can even say purposes and themes of the book of Daniel. One is personal godliness, and without making a lot of commentary on that, we can see this in the lives of Daniel and his three friends. That is a devotion and a loyalty to God even under stressful circumstances and conditions. Remember being brought as an exile into Babylon, and then you'll see the issue about the worship of this golden idol, and you'll see Daniel in the lion's den and things of that nature. But nevertheless, the loyalty to God was unfazed. They remained loyal. Another thing that we see in purpose and themes, and this is a very strong theme that we see in the book of Daniel, God's sovereignty over the nations and kings. In other words, God establishes nations according to his will, and he sets up kings to rule over them, whomever he chooses. And this is so important. And I don't want to digress much, but this is so important for us to remember now. Let me say this. Let me take an aside. So listen, the theme of Daniel, whoever is king, God made him king. God, and we'll see this in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, I'm sorry, not in the dream of it's a part of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and then how God brings judgment upon Nebuchadnezzar later on in the book of Daniel. But the point is, it is God, as Nebuchadnezzar himself will say, raises men to be king. And it doesn't matter whether they are the lowest of men or not. God makes them and establishes them to be king. So one of the themes of Daniel, God established, he rules over the nations, all the nations, and he sets up kings over the nations whom he chooses. Now, the reason why I wanted to digress, and I don't want to get too excited, is we need to always remember, with this thought in mind, this very principle in mind, whomever is king, or we can call it the president, or whatever you want to call it, the ruler of the nation, always remember God has made him the ruler of that nation, the king, the president, or whatever. So whether it's Joe Biden, God made him president, or whether it's Donald Trump, God made him president for whatever the reasons God may have in the furtherance of his plans. These men are under the providence of God when it comes to their leadership. Okay, so we'll say that and we'll be through with that. Another point, God's faithfulness to his covenant people. Remember, Israel was in Babylon in the first place because of their disobedience. So therefore, they were being disciplined harshly, disciplined by God, but nevertheless, even though they were exiled into Babylon, God yet remained faithful to them. Another point, to outline the times of the Gentiles. And this is a beautiful thing too. And this is one of the principal points that we also see in Daniel. The times of the Gentiles simply means this: the time period when the Gentile nations affect and have rule over Israel. The times of the Gentiles. Okay, so that period came at the time of Israel's exile, Judah, Jerusalem, exile into Babylon, and continues to this day. The times of the Gentiles will not be over with until the return of Jesus himself. And this is what we can see even in, okay, I don't want to get into it. I'm premature already. I'm sorry. In the visions or the dreams that Daniel interpreted for the kings, it has to do with the times when the Gentile nations will rule over Israel until the coming of the Messiah, when he will set up his kingdom upon the earth and rule over all the nations. Okay. Now, another point, Israel's future deliverance. And we can see the relationship this with the times of the Gentiles. Why? Israel will be finally delivered once Jesus comes and sets up his kingdom. And this will happen at the end of the times of the Gentiles. Now, let me talk about another couple of points that are interesting too in the book of Daniel. One is the literary form of Daniel. The literary form of Daniel is what we call apocalyptic. And that is like when God gives a man a particular vision, and then in that vision, you have a lot of symbols and signs, but those symbols and signs usually can be interpreted from the context of the passage itself or from other scripture itself. So you got a lot of signs, and then it has to do with the final deliverance of God's people. And here, the final deliverance of God's people here, with respect to the text, would be Israel. Israel's final deliverance, and even Israel's becoming the head of all nations. Why will Israel be the head of all nations? Because Christ, the Messiah, will be there. And as Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus will be over all nations. But anyway, so that literary form is prophetic, apocalyptic. Now we can see this primarily with another book, the book of Revelation. And actually the Greek word apocalypsis is revelation, unveiling. Okay, so Daniel and Revelation, and you'll be able to tell once we get into the text, have a lot of things in common in apocalyptic books. Also, too, you can see other apocalyptic language in books like Zechariah, Ezekiel. Okay, but we're not getting to all of that. Language, beautiful. The languages in the book of Daniel is Hebrew and Aramaic. Hebrew is the language for the Jews. Aramaic is the language for the Babylonians. It was basically the trade language of that day. Or in other words, Hebrew for the Jews, Aramaic for the Gentiles. And when we look at the book of Daniel, Hebrews is in it is written in the language Hebrew, chapters 1 and 2, the first part of chapter 2. If you want to be exact, chapter 1 up to chapter 2, verse 4. And then in between that, might as well cover the Hebrew, 2 and 4, and then chapters 8 through 12. That's in Hebrew. But in chapters 2, beginning at verse 4 again, that latter part of verse 4, up until the end of chapter 7 is written in Aramaic. And what is so beautiful about how God did this in writing it in Hebrew and then getting into writing it in the middle part, so to speak, in Aramaic, the beautiful part is it deals with the Gentiles. So notice, as it has to do with the Israel, you see the Hebrew. As it has to do with the Gentiles and their effect or their influence, and it's a tough influence, upon the Jewish nation, it is written in Aramaic, the Gentile language, so to speak. All right. But anyway, enough of that. I can't wait to get into the book of Daniel. Truly hope that you enjoyed as much as I look forward to enjoying it with you. All right, guys. See you next time.